Good morning and welcome to the Australian Organic Trade webinars. This morning we are talking about Indonesia. We have a great program for you. We have Catherine Mudford from Asialink. She will be joined by Dr. Ackerman and they will be concentrating on Indonesian culture and business. We will then have a break followed by Najib Lohan from Export Connect, and he will be talking about market opportunities within Indonesia, followed by myself, and I will be talking about import and export regulations for getting your organic product from Australia into Indonesia. And so without further ado, I want to hand over to Catherine, who will talk to us about Indonesia. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Josephine. Good morning, everybody, and we're really looking forward to the session this morning. My colleague Kat's going to share some slides with us and we'll get started straight away. I'm going to be joined, as Josephine has said, by Dr. John Ackerman this morning. And really delighted to have John with us. You'll see him on screen too. John is based in Indonesia, in Jakarta right now, and has been based in Indonesia for the last 15 years. He's the founding director of Mitra Asia Lestari, and that's a company focused on sustainable business development and also increasing leadership capacity in Southeast Asia. Based out of Jakarta, John sits on the boards of the International Business Chamber in Indonesia and the Indonesia-Australia Business Council. So really delighted to have his expertise in the session today, and particularly just that ability to give a real-time viewpoint of Indonesia here and now. So looking forward to having that voice shortly. Just a quick introduction for those of you who haven't met me or Asialink Business previously too. I'm the director for capability development at Asialink Business, which is Australia's National Centre for Asia Capability. So our real mandate is, how do we help organisations like yours increase that knowledge, skill, expertise to understand and connect with different Asian countries and markets in service of building your businesses. So delighted to have the chance to do that this morning. If I could start by just acknowledging country. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are present today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending this session online today. So in the first hour that we have together with you, John and I would like to do three things. We'd like to give an overview of Indonesia. We'd like to then think about some frameworks that might help in navigating culture. How do we work across Australian and Indonesian cultures to be most impactful? And to use that then to think about, from an Indonesia perspective, how do we get some insights into that mindset that will help you then in setting up for success in Indonesia? To get us started, we would love to know a little bit more about those of you who are joining us on today's webinar, and particularly the kind of experience that you might have already with Indonesia. So a poll is popping up right now. Can you select the answer or answers that are most true for you? So are you currently doing business in Indonesia? Working with Indonesia counterparts? Or perhaps you've visited Indonesia for business or visited Indonesia on holiday? Or maybe you are joining today with very little experience of Indonesia. So we'll give you a minute to choose the option or the options that are most true for you. Lovely, and I know it takes a minute to get those choices coming up. So yeah, that just gives us a little bit of sense of who's in the room, who's online, and the experience that you have so far. So you might be already doing business, you might have visited previously, you might have very little experience. And Kat, once we've got a few of those answers coming through, let's see who we've got in the room. So yeah, great. So 42%, almost half of the group are either currently doing business in Indonesia or working with Indonesian counterparts. So quite a lot of experience. And yet we have another half who've responded who've said very little experience. So I guess as we go into the session today, we're hoping to give those of you who have a lot of experience the chance to go a bit deeper. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we cover off some of those foundational pieces in terms of getting you started. Please do use the chat if you have questions as we go. We're here really to make sure that the session is focused on what's important for you. So we'll stop for questions during the session, but if you have questions as you go along, feel free to just pop them into the chat and we'll come to them as we can. So I guess many of you who are joining today's webinar are joining because you probably appreciate that Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia and the 16th largest economy in the world. In recent years, we've seen Indonesia's GDP growing at around 5% annually. It's also the world's third largest democracy, behind only India and the US. And with that population of 269.6 million as at 2019, so almost 270 million. Indonesia really presents some significant opportunities for Australian businesses. And yet, while Indonesia is our closest neighbour, we've often been described, Australia and Indonesia, as strangers next door. So over the next hour, what we'd like to do is share some info and some insights which we hope close that gap a little and make us less of strangers, give you some opportunities to think more about the opportunities and the challenges for your business in Indonesia. And with that, I'm really delighted to hand on to John, who, as I said, coming to us from Jakarta today, John, with deep expertise over the last 15 years of living and working in Indonesia, and delighted to hand over to you to get us started this morning.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Before I start, can I just get a thumbs up that you can hear me clearly? It's all good. All right, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Catherine and Josephine, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Indonesia to the participants today. I do note in your poll, Catherine, that you probably should have had one other question there, which was, am I Indonesian? Because I'm well aware that we actually do have a participant potentially online who is not only based here, but Indonesian by birth. So minta maaf kalau saya pakai kata-kata yang salah, Pak. I want to run through a few things today, as Catherine's noted, talk a little bit about the culture, a few insights about Indonesia itself in terms of the doing business with Indonesia. And as Catherine put in her introduction, not only are we potentially strangers next door, but certainly the trade and investment relationship between our two countries is probably a little underdone. I used to work for the red meat and cattle industry, and that was a term that was often referred to, pun intended. And I should note before I forget this that we've just actually recently had the 1-year anniversary of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement being into effect. Programs between our two governments and our two countries will roll out to support companies and businesses in both countries to try and look and help for opportunities with that as well. So as we're sort of moving through these things, please don't forget about that. And certainly, if you have any questions or comments or thoughts as we're moving through this, please don't hesitate to put something in the chat. and I will get to it when I can throughout this session, if not immediately, certainly towards the end. Next slide. Thanks, Kate. So, as I mentioned earlier, I know some of you do have significant experience in Indonesia and some of you probably not so. For those with significant experience, I think these two images will sort of bring home to you, and for those not so experienced in Indonesia, bring a sense that Indonesia really is a land of contrasts. And there's a couple of aspects I wanted to point out with this particular slide, is that over the next hour, I will be speaking relatively generally. We don't have a lot of time to get into specifics on things, and I need to note a sort of certain sense of caution around my generalisation, as Indonesia is an extremely diverse country, multiple ethnicities, cultures, languages. It really is very diverse. For those of you that know it well, will understand the term Dari Sabang sampai Merauke, which in essence really sort of reflects unity in a diverse, multilingual and sprawling country. This picture also, I wanted to bring it up because I think it really does emphasise the way people's experience in Indonesia possibly reflects their perceptions. A lot of Australians go into Bali every year, but not so many travel further outside of Bali into some of the other regions. So your perception of Indonesia might be that on the right, whereas for those of us in Jakarta and the more busy cities, some of our perceptions are that on the left. Next slide, thanks, Kate. I'd like to think we're all fairly well versed in where Indonesia sits. And the point of this particular slide is given its location and its size, I wanted to emphasise the point that Indonesia really is more than just a trading nation with Australia. We are neighbours, very close neighbours. And to paraphrase that comment that Catherine made again, that maybe we're still strangers next door. And I wanted to point and alert people to this, that there is a book written by Tim Lindsay and Dave McRae, which is a series of essays written by both Indonesian and Australians, outlining what our relationship looks like across a range of sectors. If you've got the time and inclination, I certainly would recommend it. But obviously, even being neighbours, there are significant differences that exist between our two countries, both in terms of culture, history, prosperity, and economic development. And one key aspect, if we were to redraw the map of Indonesia and Australia based on its population, those two images would look very, very different. But Indonesia has an extremely rich and complicated history. Indonesia itself has been trading with Australia's indigenous population for hundreds of years. And certainly Indonesia recognises itself, and this comes back to my point about generalising, it recognises over 700 dialects across the country. But it is certainly an important country in the region. The ASEAN Secretariat is based in Jakarta here, and its related research agencies also based in Jakarta. One particular important point about this image and possibly the image of Indonesia and Australia on a global scale is that international issues may not itself be as important to Indonesia as we view them in Australia. And I just want you to keep that in mind as we move through a few things. Next slide, thanks, Kat. Again, a few statistics about Indonesia. It's the largest archipelago in the world. For those interested in the marine environment, it is the centre of biodiversity. It's the fourth most populous nation, and Catherine outlined about 270 million people currently. expected to be approximately 326 million in the next 20 to 25 years. Similar to Australia, 3 time zones due to the breadth of the country. I mentioned before the comment dari Sabang sampai Merauke. That refers to the most western and most eastern towns of the country itself. And it's often used as a statement to represent the sort of the depth and diversity of the country. It's from sort of dawn till dusk. It's a similar equivalent. Java, down on the bottom left-hand side of that image with the 2 flags, Jakarta and Surabaya, an island home to over 60% of that 270 million population. Jakarta, the capital, essentially the centre of central government, home to about 35 million people if you include the urban areas, often referred to as Jabodetabek, which encompasses not just Jakarta but surrounding satellite cities which have sort of been brought into the urban area of Bogor, Depok, Tangerang and Bekasi. Other islands included in that picture, and obviously I can't go through all 17,000 of them, but we have Sulawesi in the centre and Sumatra towards the left. Between those 3 islands, they probably generally reflect the more developed islands. Surabaya, the city to the east of Jakarta and on the same island of Java, a gateway to the east of Java. And I wanted to point to Surabaya a little bit. I think many Australians look and understand Jakarta is an enormous city in itself. They consider Bali as a tourist area and probably don't give enough consideration to other quite industrialised cities such as Surabaya, Makassar and Medan. Now, Surabaya, again, the gateway to East Java, has got strong business development and growth. Not necessarily always easy to import products into that particular province, but it's a city of nearly 5 million people and has access to that province of over 50 million people and probably close to 100 million people just in their regional location there. So it's a city sort of equivalent to the size of Melbourne or Sydney. Medan, similarly, a city of about 2.5 million people. Different approaches, different ideals, demands and drivers in all of these cities in itself. But if you're looking to do business with Indonesia itself, it is well worth looking at some of the regional areas there because there are large populations and their economic development is significant. Next slide. Again, for those that don't necessarily know Indonesia particularly well, I think the reflection or thought processes from Australians that it is predominantly a Muslim nation, and it certainly is, but it is a multi-ethnic society, and it is a mostly successful multi-ethnic society. Bahasa Indonesia is the national language, but again, over 700 dialects recognised through the country, and most people through Indonesia will either speak or at least understand another dialect here. So when you're talking to your Indonesian colleagues or counterparts, and maybe English isn't necessarily their first language, but it could well be their third or fourth. There are 6 state recognised religions, being Islam, Protestant, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism and Confucianism. Now, there certainly have been religious and ethnic tensions, quite significant ones in the past. These have largely waned in recent years, although there are still local challenges between that. Couple of things I wanted to add into this slide as well. When you are working through some of the larger cities, Jakarta, Surabaya, and even through the island of Bali, it's relatively easy to forget the religious components, and particularly in Jakarta, it's easy to forget that it's a majority Muslim country, but it is well worth remembering some simple sort of etiquettes associated with it. For instance, Friday prayer is particularly important to Muslims, so please don't organise meetings between 12 and 2 on a Friday. And religious holidays are particularly important as well. There's the fasting month of Ramadan, followed by anything from sort of 4 to 10 day holiday of Eid al-Fitr. Probably similar to the way Australians view the Christmas holidays. So they are particularly important time periods. And of course, public holidays throughout the year reflect the diversity in the religions. It is the Islamic New Year tomorrow, public holiday, but there are quite a number of holidays throughout the year for Indonesians, including the Ascension of Jesus Christ, obviously Easter, Chinese New Year, and Nyepi Day for some of the regions. A day where not much is meant to be done. Next slide. I wanted to touch a little bit on government and democracy and government structure. I think Catherine mentioned before, it's the third largest democracy in the world, but it's still an emerging market economy and in some respect an emerging democracy. But it's possibly, Australia might look at its own politics and think it's complex, but Indonesia's politics and government structure is certainly a complex one. There are essentially 7 layers of government here in Indonesia: the central government, provincial government, and the Kabupaten, being districts, reflect similarly to the way Australia's structure is over federal, state, and local council. But additional to those in Indonesia, there is also the Kecamatan, the Kelurahan, the RT, and the RW. The lower levels generally reflect a sort of a local engagement. It might be even the surrounding block that you live in. And there are administrative processes that go along with moving from one location to another. It can make it actually quite a complex structure to move around. 5 guiding principles of national life here in Indonesia, what's referred to as the Pancasila, and that is a belief in God, humanity, nationalism, democracy, and social justice. Different political cycles compared to Australia. We run on a 3-year cycle. Indonesia runs on a 5-year cycle. We're currently in the 2019 to 2024 cycle. The political parties don't run such as a 2-party preferred system as in Australia. There used to be about 30 political parties here in Indonesia. I think then there was 10. Currently, and please don't quote me on this figure, I think there are 17. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to follow. They do form coalitions, though, to establish government here. Parliament structure itself is quite complex, with nearly 700 parliamentarians, reflecting both a central and a regional approach to governing Indonesia. The current president's vision for Indonesia under his 2019 to 2024 government essentially can be summarised or focused on about 5 key points, and that is infrastructure and human resource development, facilitating investment, increasing and providing further affordable healthcare and education, and similar to his last 5-year period, a continued bureaucratic reform. You probably can't talk about Indonesia without mentioning that corruption is still a perennial challenge here for Indonesia, both in terms of business and government. And unfortunately, there are international organisations that have ranked Indonesia's probably some of its largest organisations as being more corrupt than most. And in many instances, that refers to Parliament, the courts and police. So it's not unusual to find Indonesian population potentially not trusting laws, not trusting how they're upheld, and possibly not necessarily following them themselves. Next. I want to just touch very quickly on some strengths and weaknesses re Indonesia. There's a couple of very, very quick points I want to make at this particular point. We talked about the population of Indonesia itself, but key to this is that half the population is actually currently under the age of 35, and that actually emphasises and highlights that there really is some significant growth. A couple of statistics for you, that whilst there's about 50 million people currently in the consuming class, it's predicted that over the next 10-year period, there will be up to 135 million. It is a very young population. It is growing, incomes are growing, and therefore there's some changing consumer patterns and some very strong consumer confidence through Indonesia. It's not just about 270 million people, but the growth of the economy and the growth of consumption. Next slide, thanks, Kat. I'm sure you've all read the news about COVID and the challenges that Indonesia is facing. It's certainly been a tough 18-month period for most people here. We had a peak of cases through the December-January period, and of course going through a peak of cases currently. I think it would be fair to say that if you're working with or you've got friends within Indonesia, it is highly unlikely that they haven't been impacted significantly either through health or deaths, family, friends, or some sort of economic challenges. I'm happy to talk a little bit further about that at a later point. Next slide, thanks, Kat. I'll just touch on this very, very quickly. E-commerce through Indonesia has grown. It was growing prior to COVID. COVID gave it a bit of a booster shot in the arm. There are large numbers of internet users, biggest Facebook group or second largest Facebook group in the world, large smartphone ownership here, and certainly companies developing and building their e-commerce platforms emerging to become quite large quite quickly, and certainly poses significant opportunities for people wanting to do business through that mechanism. Next slide, thanks. If we're talking about doing business, particularly in food products, it is important for me to just touch quickly on halal requirements. Now, this is a whole masterclass in itself, in reality, but a couple of key points to refer to. Prior to about 2019, all of the halal certification processes was really overseen by Majelis Ulama Indonesia, MUI. But back in 2014, a new halal law was written and put into force in October 2019. It now actually changes the structure of how this works. And essentially, there is now a new body that sits under the Ministry of Religion, BPJPH, which is essentially the Product Assurance Organising Agency. They work closely with MUI, who will provide the fatwas about the way halal will work. BPJPH will certify a halal examination agency, or an LPH, which provides halal auditors. There are also other ministries involved where it comes to particular sectors, so it has become a little more complex. It is still rolling out in terms of how the requirements actually work. But in short, if you're looking to send product from Australia to Indonesia, you will need to get an Islamic organisation in Australia to certify your product. They will need to be registered with BPJPH to be able to provide that. Next slide, thanks, Kat. perception of Australian food and food products. I wanted to touch on this very, very quickly. We certainly are recognised that Australia provides high quality and premium products. We're also recognised in that particular field that some of our products can be quite expensive. Nutrition and safety, food health aspects, are starting to become more and more of a focus for consumers compared to what they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And again, I'll point you back to the statistic that Indonesia is a very, very young population and consumer demands are changing. For Indonesian consumers, we're now seeing more and more that they are looking for an experience, and how that actually relates to food or to product relates to how people are selling that particular product. Now, we've got the comment that Australian products are perceived as being fresh. I wanted to point out, though, that fresh means something very, very different here in Indonesia. If you're talking about a fresh meat product, it essentially means that it is still warm. It's not in polystyrene packaging in a refrigerated section of a large retail chain. So when you're talking about your product being fresh, be a little bit aware of what that actually means in terms of your message. Sorry, Kat, can I just come back very quickly? In terms of, we've done a little bit of marketing work, or I've been involved in marketing and understanding consumer preferences. And there's some real theme importances around food product. And I apologise if not everybody's involved in the food industry here. I tend to revert back to food and agriculture quite regularly. Theme importance, and again, this comes to working with and looking to sell a product in Indonesia. Halal is certainly one of the most important. Being of a natural, safe, good value, country of origin, nutritional, and providing recipes are also themes that fall out as particularly important to Indonesian consumers. Next slide. And in that regard, organics, nutrition are starting to pop up into consumer mindsets. And while the growth of organic market is still somewhat limited, again, due to price, because price becomes an important component of consumer preference here, these particular aspects are important. Again, coming back to some consumer research, those key themes that I mentioned were actually part of 30 aspects which were asked of consumers to identify what potentially motivates them to buy a particular product or even to eat that product. And some of these aspects included halal, grading certificates, use by dates, preservatives, the amount of sodium, safety certification, price, country of origin, cooking instructions that come with that particular product, etc. But a natural product, i.e. 100% natural, came up second, and organic comes up fifth in those 30 particular aspects. So experience, health, food, safety, and nutrition are all making their way into consumers' mindsets and certainly popping up a lot on social media in influencers' accounts. Next slide. So thanks, Catherine, and thanks, everyone. I'll hand back to Catherine for now.
Thanks, John. And you know, as we move into the next session, just reflecting on exactly some of that, you know, the origin in terms of the complexity, the diversity of being in Indonesia and being Indonesian, really plays to, so what does that mean when we think about the most important values, you know, how the culture has unfolded and what that might mean for Australians who are thinking about connecting with key stakeholders, thinking about what's important to consumers. And we wanted to move into a session that drills down on that a little bit more. So folks who've been part of the Organics webinar series on exporting to different Asian markets, you will have seen this framework before, but for those of you who might be at your first webinar, when we talk about cultural intelligence or CQ, we're really thinking about our ability to work effectively in cultures which are different and diverse from our own. And so there are three things that we watch out for or that help us build that muscle around being culturally intelligent. And the first one is just simply understanding the what, having some knowledge of what the culture looks like and why. The second piece is definitely just this focus on we can't understand the what or every what of Indonesian culture. We've heard already how diverse it is. So there's this piece around, are we able to just notice what comes up? Are we noticing what goes on? So if we're culturally intelligent, just being conscious of what's different, how does that play out, what's going on right here? Because having that ability then allows us to do this third thing, which is make some decisions around how we're going to behave. And so we'd just like to move into the rest of the session to share a little bit around the what and how we might notice or observe that, make some decisions around what we'll do based on that. Next. So we thought we might start by asking you, who might be right about Australians? So a group of Singaporeans and a group of Indonesians were asked to describe the traits of an Australian group. And so group A on the left-hand side said, well, when we think of Australians, we think of them as being rushed. We think of them as being hard-headed. We think of them as sometimes being a bit harsh, and we think of them as very disciplined. Second group of managers were asked to reflect on what they thought of Australians. And here's what they said. Oh yeah, Australians are pretty laid back. They're very optimistic. They don't always take things seriously. They can be a little bit self-indulgent. So I guess my question to you, and please use the chat, which group do you think is from Indonesia? Group A or Group B? I love it. We've got a couple of answers already. So which group? So we've got Joseph saying, yeah, maybe Indonesia's Group A. And we've got an alternate point of view, maybe Group B. Any other thoughts? $50-50? Yeah. So the question is, a group of Indonesians and a group of Singaporeans were asked to describe Australians. On the left-hand side, Group A have said Australians are rushed and reserved. On the right-hand side, we've got Group B who've said Australians are relaxed and fun-loving. And we're curious as to which group might have said which. So is Group A Indonesian or Singaporean? That's my first question. Group A from Indonesia or from Singapore? Yep, great. Yeah, a little bit of a rework on the chat. So if we got the question right, which we may not have, I'll give it to Andrew. Yeah, so we've got a couple of you going, yeah, actually Group A are Indonesian, and you're spot on. Others saying Group A. So it's interesting to think about why there might be differences. So you've got two groups, both looking at Australians. And depending on your starting point, whether you're in Singapore or whether you're in Indonesia, the language used to describe those Australians and the experience of those Australians is quite different. And what we wanted to do is give a bit of a sense of why you can see geographically, Singapore and Indonesia are quite close. But culturally, they're quite different in terms of what they value, what they might expect in terms of the way you would behave to be successful in a business context. And that's why we see the difference here. So let's take a look at what some of those differences are and why we might see those answers. John, you and I talked quite a lot before we came onto the webinar this morning around some of the things that are really important in terms of an Indonesian context. And you already mentioned again this morning, just some of those core beliefs in terms of the belief in God and humanity, the importance of nationalism and social justice in terms of being really at the core of what's important in Indonesia and what really drives the way Indonesians may think and act. So we've sort of we've described those in those simple ways, John. You know, this belief in God, this sort of focus on the importance of hierarchy, the role of paternalistic leadership, this interdependence, and this real importance about harmony and not offending or showing anger. Can you share a little bit, John, around you know, how you see that playing out and examples of what that looks like in reality?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Catherine. I'll just touch on this very quickly because I know we're going to drill into this a little bit more as we step through some of the next slides. Beliefs for Indonesia are obviously truly important and not necessarily are we specific to religion here, belief in God. But many Indonesians themselves can be superstitious about particular aspects as well. And so that obviously plays out in terms of how things operate, how things are done. The hierarchical component is a really important one because this reflects not just in terms of how to do business, but also related to the community, the home, the village, friends. It relates to the position you hold or the title you actually have. And it can be really important as to how you engage, both in terms of a personal and professional basis. The interdependence component, again, community and family here are really important. Something that I try and stress with my own staff regularly and often, and this not necessarily just in terms of an Indonesian context actually, but it is important here, is to emphasise that, you know, family is actually more important than the job. So I sort of reflect and remind my staff often that they should keep considering that. It's very easy to get your blinkers on sometimes and forget a little bit about it, but I try and remind even my own Indonesian staff that they've got to keep that, and I think it's appreciated. And of course, the avoiding offence component, I think that relates probably anywhere in the world, really. It's a good practice to have, but certainly for the Indonesian context, you know, personal and professional aspects are built on relationship and trust. And therefore, avoiding offence is really, really important, particularly when relationship and trust is so important. I'll hand back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, John. Next slide, Kat.
Thanks. I think that's me again. Thank you. So a couple of aspects in terms of sort of considering about this in a little more detail. As I mentioned, Islam is the majority religion here in Indonesia, and it is important, but it's also important that, again, the country is extremely diverse in itself, and particular regions may not have a majority of Muslims there. neither are all Muslims Sunni. There are Shia religions through that Muslim aspect as well. So it's important to I suppose, recognise, understand, because that can have implications about how your personal relation or your actual business relationship works. The collective mindset, I do think this is a really important point. In a very general sense, Indonesia is a highly nationalistic country. I hesitate to use that word sometimes because I think in sort of recent history, nationalism is starting to get a particularly bad name. But I say this in a very positive light. Indonesians do have a sense of pride about their country, and I think that's particularly important. And I, again, emphasise that community and family values are extremely important here. And it becomes really important when you're looking to start engagements or you've got a project that you want to begin, that it's not just about the discussion or developing consensus, but there's a real need here to actually do a lot of consultation processes. And it's not necessarily that you need to get consensus in all occasions, but you just need to provide the community, be it where you're actually working or the sector in the business, some sense of being able to have put their voice forward. And that becomes really important when doing business. The hierarchical aspect, again, decisions being made by senior individuals. Decisions are made and they are expected to be made by those with position or title. When I talk about sort of position, you're talking director, director general, CEO, commissars, chairs, presidents. The title within a job is a particularly important aspect. Sorry, the position is a particularly important aspect, and the title can also be important. Doctors and professors here are held up in high, but so is age. Elders within communities or businesses are certainly shown the respect of their experience. And even how you refer to people here. I mean, we have Mr. and Miss in the Western concept, but Indonesia has Bapak and Ibu to show respect to men and women of higher authority, and other terminologies for people that might be more junior in either position or age. And again, this hierarchy aspect should be, I suppose, recognised, understood. You'll see that it will be extremely unlikely for a junior member to interrupt a senior member in a business meeting. And there's a couple of points to remember to that. Probably neither should you when you're trying to meet with people. And it's always good to acknowledge those senior people in the room or the Zoom meeting you're on when you're introducing yourself, to actually work through titles and names of people. Australians are viewed as being generally aggressive and somewhat arrogant. So it's important to avoid some of that behaviour that can be perceived as confrontational. And smile is probably the best. If you're getting frustrated, smile a little more. Anger identifies a lack of character and certainly will lead to a loss of respect. But at the same time, don't be too casual or flippant with your approach. It's good to keep a light-hearted approach with your Indonesian colleagues and counterparts, certainly in the early stages, but keep it formal and respectful. And the last one really on there, reciprocity. Australia's a little bit too quick often, and there are multiple reports that have been written, governments, businesses, about and referring to how Australia is going to win in the Asian century. Now, that obviously is pertinent and reflects well to Asian businesses and mindsets, but it's not necessarily reflected well here. Where there's a winner, there's actually a loser. So it's really good to try and focus on that reciprocity and emphasising benefits for all. Sorry, there is one more, of course, the rubber time. It happens. Traffic jams can be bad, certainly through some of the busy cities, and you will find that people will turn up late for things. Don't get frustrated or angry with it. Be patient and avoid it yourself if you can. Thanks, Kat. Next slide.
And John, maybe just before we jump to the next slide, one thing that we haven't covered particularly is sort of the colonial past of Indonesia. And I just asked maybe if you want to share a few thoughts on that, particularly when we think about nationalism and this kind of response to winning in Asia, and kind of, it might be useful to hear a few of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Actually, a really good point. And I'd even written myself a couple of dot points just on the note when we were looking at the iceberg, because additional to what's underneath what we see, history and language are also particularly important. And in particular reference to that, you know, winning, Australia winning in the Asian century. There were a lot of media reports that came out when I think the government white paper back in, and again, don't quote me on this, back in 2012 was released. Might have been earlier than that. Australia in the Asia century. The forward talked about Australia winning, and Indonesia's component to that was, well, if there's a winner, there's a loser, and this sounds again like it's the new colonisation. Obviously, Indonesia's history with 400 years of Dutch colonialism is still fresh in some elders' minds, and certainly Japan occupying the country for a couple of years through the Second World War is something that many elder Indonesians still remember. So it's important to remember that history, look at some of those particular aspects, and when you're approaching Indonesia in terms of your business, again, it comes back to that reciprocity aspect and benefits for all, and not looking as if you're the new colonialism.
Yeah, thanks for that, John, and also sort of sharing. I know Unilever executives have said to me, you know, a couple of their products are incredibly popular in Indonesia, but their own research says that Indonesians will say this is an Indonesian brand. So they've taken the Unilever product. Yeah, this is ours, and I guess just that mindset of being willing, perhaps, to be seen as so connected that you're owned locally is a really important part of that success. Kat, we might just move to the next frame. So I suppose as some of you were listening to the examples that John was sharing around, you know, what's important and what you might expect to see culturally in Indonesia, it's interesting, isn't it, to contrast it with that framework of what's important to us typically in Australia and what might be typically important in an Indonesian context. And of course, these 5 dimensions are really designed as a general sense of what you'll see. Obviously, we've said already, Indonesia is incredibly diverse, and we would expect to see differences from individual to community. But on the whole, they start to paint a picture of what we might expect to see in a country. And Kat, could I just maybe pop to the next slide? So the first thing that we sort of think about, you know, is it important in this country, in this context, to focus more on the group or on the individual? And we can see that in Australia, we put a lot of emphasis on the importance of individual identity. We contrast that with what we see in Indonesia and what we're hearing from John, which is there's a lot of emphasis and importance put on the group identity. So being part of the family, being part of the community, being part of the business place, the group being far more important than the individual. The second piece that you're hearing a lot about is this dimension around, how should our group work together? How should it be structured? How should we communicate? Who has power to take decisions? And in Australia, we have, this strong sense that we are able and should and are expected to have an equal voice and an equal contribution, and that decision making should be shared to a large extent. In Indonesia, exactly as we've heard John say, there's a much stronger view that while there's an opportunity to gain voice and get some of that consensus, in the end, decisions will be taken by the most senior people within the group. And often that might be job title, or that might be position, or that might be age. But hierarchy is important, and understanding the nature of the hierarchy as it plays out is really key in terms of sort of working out how decisions will be made. We didn't talk as much around this third dimension, which is just, in a context of how much information, how much clarity do I need about all the facts and figures and what's going on in order to take a decision. And in Australia, typically we're comfortable to take decisions without too much, with a little bit less information, willing to take a few more risks. Not quite the same in Indonesia, where there's a desire for more information, a little bit more data in order to make those decisions moving forward. The fourth thing that you're seeing there in terms of, communicating around what we need, giving feedback, that dimension of, how direct or indirect can we be? Again, you can see that there's a huge difference here between an Australian preference and an Indonesian preference. In fact, it's the most stark. And so, while in Australia, we have a communication style that's pretty direct, and we think it's appropriate, to call a spade, to let you know directly whether we want or don't want to do something in a certain way. In Indonesia, it's much less direct, and we'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment, in terms of, ways to say yes and ways to say no, and what we really mean when we hear a yes, or what's really being said when we hear yes. It may mean very many other things in an Indonesia context. And John's spoken too just about, in Australia, typically, our focus on tasks means we have a shorter mindset. We're really quite keen to go in to work out the possibilities, to get to work in getting a deal up and running as soon as possible. We've heard that sort of regulatory-wise, that will take longer. But beyond just the regulatory process, it's the time that it takes to build and establish a relationship, which has a much longer viewpoint in Indonesia, which is pretty important for you to think about as you're thinking about how to navigate this context. If I were just to sum that up, Kat, we might just turn to the next slide, if I may. So the sort of words you'll typically hear around Australians is we tend to be more forthright, more assertive. We step into conflict. That's the way we like to deal with it. And there's a high degree of informality. In Indonesia, we're going to see things which are quite different. Yes may actually mean no. The focus on face saving, which means that it's not okay to be seen to be wrong, or to point out that others are wrong, to bring shame to your group or to others around you. And so lots of quite, complex ways of negotiating what goes on in order to save face. And then this other piece around the formal and paternalistic. So there is a very clear hierarchy in terms of how decisions are made and how things get done. And it's useful for us to think about a few ways that you might navigate that when you're doing business. Kat, I might just move to the next slide. Probably the two biggest things, John, that we talked about in terms of helping our Australian businesses be set up for success, this ability to deal with direct versus indirect ways of getting things done. And then the second piece of, how do we How do we understand these multiple meanings of yes? So we talked about the fact that, you know, Australians tend to be egalitarian, time conscious, direct. We value forthrightness, practicality. And in contrast, we've got Indonesian managers who tend to be more paternalistic, expect to know the answers and not be challenged. And this valuing harmony amongst employees is really important.
We've lost your audio, Catherine.
Better? Yeah. John, handing over to you, could you give us a couple of examples of what you see, particularly in this space, in terms of how we can deal with this indirect way of getting things done to be more?
Thanks, Catherine. These images themselves, I think, are particularly important, but I wouldn't want our Australian colleagues to sort of look at these and think that Indonesia's approach kind of in the red. There is a roundabout way that an indirect approach itself is sort of a negative. In fact, from my perspective, I view it quite as a positive. The Indonesian culture is an extremely polite one, and we've touched on this concept of not really saying no, or different ways to say no. I'll give you an example of that. If someone asked me, have I been to the moon? I would not use the simple response of no, but I would say not yet. No comes across in the Indonesian language as quite harsh. It's forthright, it's a bit aggressive. And that sort of relates again to the approach of not being put into an embarrassing situation. So rather than have a direct approach, which can seem a bit confrontational, it can come across as harsh. The ways of dealing with either issues or getting from point A to B can be a little bit different. Something or other that I've certainly in the 15, 16 years I've lived in Indonesia, I have found truly fascinating is that this country of nearly 270 million people, don't ever be surprised if two people from very different sectors actually know each other. I think the term 6 degrees of separation relates to how close everybody in the world is actually related or know each other. Within Indonesia, I truly think there's only about 1 or 2 degrees of separation from everyone knowing everyone else. And again, it does come back to that sort of sense of community and values being there. And consequently, that can actually alter the business approach with the way Indonesia operates things. I left the embassy as a diplomat back in early 2011, but I still have senior government officials and industry contacting me today to ask whether I can help with visa aspects. And it's not that they're looking to get around anything. It's just the approach of knowing someone that probably has a little bit of information. So that indirect approach can actually take multiple pathways. And that can take a little bit of time to move through. It can actually have some inefficiencies in it. But it's something or other to keep in mind when you're doing business is don't expect your partners to actually look at multiple other opportunities that they might be doing simultaneously, and for the benefit of you as well, not behind you, but for your benefit. So that, I'll continue on, Catherine.
Yeah, we thought we just might move into some really practical tips in terms of managing some of those situations, John. And John, we also had a question, thanks Lillian, I think, for the question around gender difference in Indonesia and how you might approach or understand that?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and thanks for the question. Gender aspects probably complex, and I from my perspective, I think again, many Australians probably have a slightly different perception in terms of what the reality is here. It can be patriarchal, a culture here. But I will point out that Indonesia had a female president before Australia actually had a female prime minister. There are certainly a lot of extremely talented, high-level CEOs, professors, director generals and secretary generals who are female across the country. And even Parliament has... And for a long time has had a sort of a minimum number of seats that should be filled by women. I think, again, a bit of a personal opinion here, I think Australia tends to focus on the gender equity. It's not necessarily a key focus for Indonesia to express it that way. But I think there is recognition that there's certainly a lot of skilled, talented women, as there are men, and they fill positions accordingly. Actually, just one other comment. There is in Sumatra itself, there is a culture there where it is matriarchal. It's still an Islamic culture, but the women own all the property. And it's handed down from mother to daughter. So it's not always, I suppose, the perception that we may consider being driven by an Islamic culture or religion.
Yeah. And Liliana says, thanks for that, John. John, you and I had talked about this sort of specific set of tips that could be useful as folks are getting ready now to think about, I might start to do more business in Indonesia, because we've got half of the group who already are or have connections with counterparts, but we've got other folks who might be thinking about their very first sort of foray into Indonesia. So talked a little bit about the use of title and formality. I wonder if you could focus a little bit on those pieces that are important in terms of how we might build credibility and relationships and trust, particularly in COVID times where things are happening virtually, and how we might think about just ensuring that, we don't cause others to lose face with our very sort of naturally assertive and direct style. What might be some of the things that you've noticed Australian businesses doing well in order to sort of overcome those two particular challenges?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Catherine. In a very general sense itself, and again, sort of coming back to that point about trust and relationship, I mean, it takes time anywhere to build that trust and respect first, including exhibiting benefits for your partner or your colleagues here. So in that regard, if you're looking to establish business with Indonesia somewhere, think long-term. Spend some time networking with like-minded, spend some time talking to successful businesses, spend some time talking to potentially those that may have been unsuccessful. Try and understand, communicate, listen rather than talk. Patience is a good virtue. Be flexible. Understand your market. And in that, I'm not just talking about, knowing that there are 270 million people here and a growing economy and a growing middle class and growing consumer numbers, but understand what messaging means to Indonesia. Again, the term fresh means two very, very different things, whilst it's a very simple word. So make sure that you're actually getting your marketing and your messaging correct. Keep your engagement at similar levels. If you're looking to meet with someone very senior, don't be surprised if they actually assign one of their staff to meet you first. Don't be offended by that. It takes time to develop that level of trust and to work your way up. Obviously, I've emphasised the different cultural aspects, and it does differ. I like to emphasise to people, don't be worried about it. Just be aware. And there's one critical aspect I found really interesting when you look at other nations working with Indonesia is, again, from my personal opinion, Indonesians in general have a very similar sense of humour to Australians. And it actually gives us a little bit of an advantage, I suppose, compared to some European or Americans who may take things a little bit more seriously, our sense of humour. So don't be afraid to try humour here and there. If it doesn't work, don't be afraid to apologise either. Saying you're sorry for something or other goes a long way. Indonesia will forgive. They may not forget, but they will forgive. Understand legal requirements as well. In terms of talking about what we have, I haven't even touched on the regulatory environment outside of the halal component. So understand the legal requirements. That can be a challenge. Business requirements and operating licenses itself. Government's trying to make them easier, but they're not necessarily easy. So understand how that works. And probably a simple approach, find a good and trusted partner here. I mentioned spend the time to understand markets, spend the time, the effort, put the resources in. Don't just assign this to one of your staff who's already working 40 hours a week. Make a dedicated effort. That in itself will show your Indonesian partners that you're actually committed and you're committed for a long term. And that goes a long way.
Yeah.
If I can, sorry, Catherine, I'm not exactly sure. I was just going to sort of give 4 take-home messages on that, if I can. Key for me, and again, this actually comes out of the book Strangers Next Door, but I thought it was a particularly pertinent aspect in that when you're looking to engage or work with or do business with Indonesia, look for opportunities to create the potential friendship. Ensure that your collaborations actually have and highlight equality for all partners. And in that regard, make sure you're actually fostering mutual interests of both groups. So you do need to understand the drivers of your partner. And certainly for some activities, it will be really important to seek out institutional support so that the activities that you're actually looking and the business that you're doing is actually considered legitimate by all participating groups. Government oversight can be important. Back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, John, for those final points. And I think in a way, it's a beautiful segue to particularly the last point in terms of, finding legitimate support for your business is a great segue into the next session that we'll run with Najib and with Josephine later, where we look at some of sort of the regulatory requirements and some of the partnering pieces in order to export into Indonesia. So thank you for that. Look, John, we have a few final moments. So just while I highlight folks some of the resources that you could connect to after this webinar, if you do have a final question or comment that you'd like to make, please do feel free to use the Q&A or the chat to let us know that. But for those of you who would like to find out a little bit more about doing business in Indonesia, some of the cultural components for you to think about, please do head to our country starter packs. So we do have a country starter pack on Indonesia and of course across all of our Asian markets for those of you who'd like to drill down and find a little bit more. So if there are no further questions, we would really just like to take that minute just to probably emphasize those couple of key points, you know, in terms of taking the time to be patient as you think about building your relationship and your business in Indonesia. I guess, John, you said it perfectly when we're thinking about it's an opportunity to really listen and learn over time, and looking for ways that are mutually beneficial in terms of, you know, what are the opportunities, not just for your business, but also for your business partner and for consumers as you're thinking to build that relationship in the longer term. In terms of where to from here, you're going to take a short break. The webinar will recommence at 12:25 Australian Eastern Standard Time. So if you'd like to head off, grab a glass of water, stretch for a few minutes, and Najib will welcome you back at 12:25.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Josephine. Thanks, Catherine.
Welcome back, everyone, to the market insight session of the masterclass. So thank you to Catherine and John for sharing the cultural insights. Certainly having exported to Indonesia for many years now and working with buyers in Indonesia for many years now, many of those hints and tips rung true. So it's been wonderful to have that information in detail. What we'll be doing now is going into detail about the market insights in terms of for food and agribusinesses. Also, we've got some hints and tips in the beauty space. So stay tuned. What I will remind everyone is that this is being recorded and that a recording can be available to those who have attended the webinar. And that the Q&A function continues and is available for anyone who has a question as we progress through the slides and the information. You know, we will either stop at that point to respond to the question if it's one that's for the whole group. We may answer it at the end of this session, and we may also answer it after the webinar if it's a heavy-duty question. Certainly for the Indonesian market, some of the questions could be heavy-duty, particularly if they relate to the registration process. Normally, we'd be in a room right now and we'd all be seeing each other. We would have shaken hands and said hello. So, but we're not. We're all online. So what we've done is we've just put up logos of some of the companies that have that are attending, just so that you can see who are your peers that are listening in on the Indonesian market. This is part of a series of masterclasses that have been delivered in the past, over the past 6 or 7 months. We've also delivered webinars on the UAE, on Singapore, on Hong Kong, on Malaysia, and a whole raft of markets. So, so today it's Indonesia's turn. Indonesia is certainly a market that and Jakarta in particular, is a place that I love to visit. Most of you who have registered and are attending know who Export Connect is, but for those of you that don't, we help food and agribusinesses select the right markets and grow by providing them with the market intelligence, market entry strategies, and pre-qualified connections, buyer connections to help them succeed. So since founding, which we're now 4 years and 2 months old, we've delivered over 220 projects to 135 clients covering 20 markets. Something that we're proud of is that almost half over a third of our projects and almost half of our revenue is from repeat business. So this is just within 4 years, and that 70% of our work is referred to us. In particular, we've delivered over 100 workshops and forums, much like this one, of which most of them now have been delivered online, and we've achieved a 100% recommendation score from businesses that attend. So very proud of that fact. We've done work for some large clients like Woolworths, Chobani, Simplot, Master Foods, but in fact the majority of the work that we do is with SMEs. And we also work very closely with stakeholders such as Australian Organic Ltd, state government agencies, Food SA, Food and Agribusiness Network, and the like. Now, we are very fortunate in this session to have had the contribution of Agrica, who is the Business Development Manager in Australia in the Jakarta office. I've known Agrica for a very long time. She's a fantastic operator, highly knowledgeable in the food and agribusiness space, and very well connected with the types of buyers that you would really want to engage with. So we pre-recorded her session because we just don't know how the internet would behave when we go live, and so we pre-recorded the session and edited it in. So so this is Agrica giving herself an introduction.
I'm the Business Development Manager for the food and beverage. We're mainly supporting the Australian exporter in the packaged food and ingredients when they're looking into Indonesian market, in finding the partner in Indonesia, as well as other type of assistance that they need from us.
Brilliant. So, looking at the agenda, we're going to focus on the market selection factors that you need to consider when assessing which markets to enter. One of the biggest challenges we find for SMEs and big companies at that point is to this point as well, is knowing which markets to focus on. Limited resources, limited time, limited budgets. You don't want to be spending a lot of your time going and looking for a market and exploring a market and going deep into a market, only to realize well down the track that it wasn't the right one for you, or that you could have gone to a different market that was perhaps had more low-hanging fruit and could have delivered a return on investment quicker. So when selecting markets for that basis, you need to look at the key economic and demographic indicators. You need to look at consumer channel and category trends. You need to check out who your competitors are in market, as well as check out your competitors on a country level by looking at the trade data. You then need to, essentially the way you could potentially do it is score according to these factors, and then the markets that come up with the highest score are the ones that you should focus on. So we're going to be doing that today. And then, of course, you don't need to go about exploring export markets on your own. There's a lot of support available, free or paid. And so we'll just go and have a look at some of those later on in this session too. So market selection factors. So what are they exactly? Well, so we are looking at economic indicators, key indicators such as GDP, GDP per capita, GDP growth, things like that. Demographics. I mean, we learned earlier from John about the how young the population is in Indonesia. We learned about the Islamic context and how within the Islamic context there are many sub-contexts. We need to look at consumer trends. Are our products hitting the right trends in Indonesia at the moment? We look at market size and market growth prospects, and then within that we look at our individual category size and what its growth prospect is, and what are the trends within our category. So if you are a drinking milk, if you're a functional beverage, if you're a breakfast cereal, what is happening in those individual spaces within the overall food and agri context, and what is happening within your categories within the retail, food service, e-commerce channels. What are the trends that are going on there? What are the dispersion rates in the market? Is it just two key retailers and then sort of a smattering of a few other retailers that you deal with, or some key food service chains and then a few from there? Or is it really broad and wide, and so it's a lot wider, and so it's a lot more competitive? On the competitor front, who are your competitors in market? Who is actually on shelf? Who are on the marketplaces? Who's on the menus in the food service outlets? And where is Indonesia mostly importing products of your category from? Right? Where does Australia fare in that? And for your category, where is Australia mostly exporting product to? Then you need to look at sort of the market access. Certainly, one of the things you have to consider for the Indonesian market is the lengthy registration process. It could take, I think, rocket speed. It takes 6 months to get your product registered. Normal is sort of 12 to 18 months, sometimes 24 months. Right? So you've got to be ready for that hard journey. And from a registration perspective, you are essentially giving all your secrets away. So there's a whole heap of faith, as John called it, in that the system will work and none of your secrets will be shared. Free trade agreements is a consideration when looking at export markets, and for Indonesia in that respect is a positive one. And what kind of certifications are you looking for? And certainly, if your product is halal certified, then if you claim your product to be halal, then you need to have the certification. Likewise, if you claim your product to be organic, you need to have the certification. If you're looking for a trade buyer and a good trade buyer, a good distributor, and your product is advertised and promoted as being organic, they are going to want to see the certificates. So let's have a look at Indonesia according to these key indicators. So from a demographic indicator perspective, compared to Australia, it's a much bigger population. It's an urban population. So its urban population is not that large, it's 57%. So compared to a market like Hong Kong, which is 100%, Singapore close to 100%, urban population in Indonesia is much lower. Now, why this is important is because we look at the overall population of 270 million people and think, wow, this is like a big market. But for high-end products, generally speaking, these are available in modern retail and modern food service. And modern retail and modern food service, you will generally only find in Indonesia in urban areas. So while 270 million sounds impressive, before we've gotten 5 seconds into reviewing the Indonesian market, we can already discount nearly 43% of the market before we get going anyway. Population growth rate is quite good, comparable to world standards. And then the Human Development Index is something that we look at for education levels, and also, you know, this sort of health focus orientation, along with gross national income per capita. So we see there, Indonesia is 107th in the world compared to, say, Australia, which is 8th. What that does is shows us that many of the consumers there may not research necessarily what they're paying for and may not have high disposable incomes. So, you know, the 27 million, in 5 seconds, we reduced that by 43%. And in about half a minute later, we know we're going to be reducing that even more. So that's not saying that Indonesia is not a good market. That's just saying we shouldn't really be looking at it as 270 million people. From a consumer characteristic perspective, there are some common traits. So, you know, the Indonesian consumers, the educated consumers with, you know, higher disposable incomes, like Australia, are seeking healthier lifestyles. You know, they are undertaking brand research, right? So not the masses, those that have traveled and have studied abroad, maybe even in Australia. You know, they're responsive to after sales service, word of mouth matters, and they're convenience seeking. So we know we heard that during Catherine's presentation. So that's really important. Some differences are that in Australia, it's largely urban population, and you know, our GDP per capita is quite high, over $50,000. So you know, overall, we have higher education standards and levels. You know, ethical mindset, focus on quality, experience seeking. We shop online more than Indonesians do, although worldwide everyone is lifting thanks to the pandemic. In Australia, we are increasingly budget conscious. You know, the general population in Indonesia are generally budget conscious, but certainly our target market are looking for you know, more premium product and are willing to spend for it. So if we look at what the pandemic has done, and John gave us a very good overview, and we're about to hear from Agrika with her overview of what the pandemic has done in the Indonesian market. You know, what we do know is that there's been, you know, significant outbreaks, and they are continuing, have really had a strong hold on the population. Many cases, many deaths, urgent need for respirators and the like. You know, that plays a little bit on sentiment. We know also from an employment perspective, many Indonesians have lost their jobs or have been stood down from their jobs, or both. The economic forecasts have dropped from a level of almost 5% that was expected to 3.8, which is still, you know, not bad. there's been that shift to value and essentials. So you know, you already had the general population focusing on value. And when it comes to the essentials, that's even more so now. There is declining loyalty, and that's come about from the base fact that consumers may have gone to the local hypermarket or whatever it is to go shop. Not local, we've gone to one that is sort of nearby-ish, but they would have traveled to it to do their shop. Now they're mostly doing their shop at the closest store, which may be a convenience store, or they're buying their product online. Either way, the product that they usually, or the brand that they usually buy, may not be available in the convenience store or online. And so therefore, they're willing to change. They're also willing to change because they may be looking for value, especially if it's for an essential. And the slow vaccine rollout has been compounding issues, which we're not familiar with in Australia at all. I'm Sydney based, so apparently we're all waiting for the vaccine rollout for us to be able to get out again. Let's hear from Agrika on this base, on about the impact of the pandemic on the Indonesian market.
The pandemic changes our life because the majority of Indonesians are working and the students are studying from home. Some of us been doing this since the start of the pandemic last year. And now currently the Indonesian government implements a quite strict movement restriction measure to curb the spread of COVID-19, which has been affecting many businesses, especially in food service, hospitality, and retail. Until today, unfortunately, the number of COVID-19 positive cases is still quite high, and therefore people only go out for essential needs. Most Indonesians is still quite positive. They're confident that vaccination is the key to returning into normal life, and the government is running the vaccination program. Unfortunately, as we have also so many people, however, it will be some time until most of us are vaccinated and protected. We also see that the growth forecast for Indonesia in this financial year is being revised downward due to the impacts of the current surge in case.
Thank you, Agrika. So let's look at consumer trends. So we know that Indonesians do trust local brands. This came up in the earlier presentation from Asialink. And so when you're looking at, and they prefer local based on the sense of nationalism, but also because they see it as being better value for money relative to foreign brands. However, having said that, the type of consumers that we would target in Indonesia, and there are enough for us to see Indonesia as a market of opportunity, are prepared to pay for a premium. We also know that there's been the shift towards e-commerce, and we're going to see a little bit later about what that looks like in more detail. But we also see a shift towards healthier foods, and that includes organic, coming off a very small base. So certified organic products in Indonesia are available in key retail outlets like Chemchicks and Hero and Ranch Market and the like. And the interest in certified organic product is growing as this shift towards healthier lifestyles and healthier eating we're seeing this movement. It is coming off a small base, but that movement is happening. And we also know that Indonesians are also looking for functional type attributes, such as added vitamins and fiber, all natural, non-GMO, higher protein, and again, organic. When we look at the channel review, and this is this data we get from Euromonitor, we can see that grocery retailing is the largest channel by far. And within grocery retailing, we see that convenience stores is the dominant one. You will rarely see a Western imported product in a convenience store. It tends to be value, essentials, and convenience stores even are an avenue for food service. So sort of noodles, heat the noodles and go type setup. Supermarkets is where we tend to find the Western imported products and a little bit later we'll see which are the key chains that stock Australian type products, and hypermarkets are the smallest, and again generally have a value feel about them. Food service is the next largest, e-commerce is the next largest channel, although note this e-commerce figure is for e-commerce as a whole. So not just food and grocery, right? And then food service next, and then we can see health and beauty there in its own category, fairly significant by scale. So when we look at the compound annual growth rates year on year for the last 5 years, we've seen hypermarkets suffer. We've seen food service suffer. We saw e-commerce flourish, and we've seen convenience pick up, and supermarkets mostly staying the same. And when we look at the compound growth rates year on year for the next 5 years, e-commerce is expected to continue to grow, but not at the same magnitude. Food service is expected to come back, and of course, food service was hit hard by the pandemic. Convenience will continue to grow at a high rate. Supermarkets will come back. Hypermarkets will come back. From a grocery retailing perspective, you see there on the right, these are the banners that predominantly would stock the Western imported products, and in particular, you're looking at Ranch Market, Food Hall, Hero, Chemchicks, Grand Lucky, Farmers Market, Transmart, Aeon. So these are the ones that would predominantly stock Western imported products. So Indonesia is still in the retail space dominated by the mom and pop type stores. Modern retail you only find in the bigger urban cities, and they'll have Indonesian product and sort of value for money type product, but they'll also have be really well stocked with Western imported products. And when you're walking up and down the aisles, you'll see quite a bit of Australian product in these stores, American and European product as well. Location is the key. For the high-end retailers, they need to be in neighborhoods where the affluent live or frequent. So as a result of the pandemic, going to the shopping centers and shopping malls is not as, it's still happening, but it's not as common as what it was happening prior to the pandemic. And so being in a neighborhood where the affluent live is really quite key and critical. Festive seasons are a big deal in Indonesia. There's definitely a spike in sales when these happen. And as John mentioned, they're about to go through a sort of like an important Islamic religious festival at the moment, starting tomorrow, I think John said. There's been a shift to better for you foods already before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated that. And so we're seeing the supermarket chains, in particular the high-end supermarket chains, increasing the shelf facings of food products that seem to boost immunity. And the high-end supermarkets are maintaining their hygienic, modern feel, so that customers come in feeling confident that they're, or feeling better about not catching the virus by shopping at these high-end stores. Food service obviously took a very big hit because of the pandemic, and in fact, many of the sort of smaller independent outlets are just not expected to come back. Even the chained food service brands had to rationalize because of the impact that it was having, the pandemic was having, and the social restrictions were having on the food service sector. They adapted like many markets in the world, having the making the food and then having it delivered through platforms similar to what we have here, like Uber Eats. Their Grab Food is one of the dominant third-party applications. So the vaccination as mentioned by Agrica, is seen as the vehicle to bring everyone back and get into food service. But this is going to take time. So it's going to come back, but it's going to take time. From a food and agribusiness perspective, looking at the Indonesian market, seeing that it's going to take time, that won't be too big a concern, because it's going to take time for us to register our products in Indonesia anyway. So the hope would be by the time the product gets through the registration process is the time that food service comes back into action, if our product is relevant to the food service channel. When we look at full service restaurants, and we look at these are chains, the chain full service restaurants. So this is where they have wait staff, and you order off a menu. You go in, you order off a menu, you sit down, you eat. In terms of cuisine, Asian cuisine within the full service restaurants dominate 95% of the full value chain. So of full value restaurants. So if you're a supplier of ingredients to Asian type cuisine, then and food service in particular is a channel that you play in, this is the perfect market from that perspective. But again, note the vast majority of the full service restaurants would be sourcing local product only. What happened there? On a limited service side of things, all the big banners and brands that we know from the US are there as well. And so when you look at the type of the type of food within the limited service restaurant chained channel, the dominant food served is chicken, followed by burgers, then Asian food, bakery products, pizza, convenience stores. So I mentioned earlier that you can get grab and go, and then ice cream. From an e-commerce trend perspective, and on the right, these are sort of the key e-commerce marketplaces that people would purchase their food and groceries from. And so there you'll see some of the major retailers like Food Hall and Ranch Market having their own, investing in their own e-commerce platform and doing well. But then you have your pure marketplace such as Shopee and Lazada. So the pandemic has certainly accelerated the demand for e-commerce, although it was already starting to grow because of traffic being a major challenge for people living in Indonesia. So if they had to travel a little bit to go to the store, it could have been an hour trip for what would otherwise take 5 minutes. So e-commerce was already growing in popularity, but the pandemic has certainly catapulted the demand for that channel to purchase product from. We're seeing that internet, is improving. People having access to smartphones is improving, and as that continues, and as people continue to become more familiar with the e-commerce channel as a form to buy food and agribusinesses, it's only expected to grow, especially considering that it is such a young population. On a health and beauty perspective, it suffered a little bit, but you saw from the figures earlier that it continued to grow, but just it wasn't at as a rapid rate as it had previously. The people not going out as much. Beauty products have suffered. Beauty salons have not opened. So there's been it hasn't been the best time, but it is still a demand for health and beauty products, in particular looking at vitamins and supplements. And so the sort of decline in cosmetics and the pickup in vitamins and supplements has helped balance it out a little bit to see some growth within the pharma space. It is expected to grow and grow well, forecast year on year over the next 5 years, and through e-commerce as well. Let's see what Agrica has to say in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had on consumer trends and channel trends.
Let me start first with the consumer. So there is this affluent consumer in Indonesia. This small percentage of Indonesian consumer are not affected financially by the pandemic. Therefore, they still have strong confidence. They can afford more premium products. They also perceive these products, such as the Australian and imported product, to be safe and healthy. However, the pandemic has led most of Indonesian consumers to be also more conscious and cautious in spending. Economic uncertainty is resulting in a general drop in personal income. So, the consumer are reducing their discretionary spending. They are adopting a more careful approach to save money. And even more so, most consumers are trading down to cheaper brands. In terms of the product, we see that health and hygiene products are in demand, and we think that it will continue to be in demand. There has been a greater consumption of vitamins and supplements with focus on boosting immunity. Consumers are also starting to pay greater attention to nutrition, safety, and cleanliness when they're purchasing food. We observe that home cooking is now preferred instead of dining out, because dining out is currently prohibited. Therefore, more consumer is looking to bring their restaurant experience to their dining table at home. We observe also more consumer supporting a small business, because more Indonesian are starting their small food business at home, and then they're also promoting the product and the promotion on social media such as Instagram and Twitter. These businesses are run by people who are working in the hospitality as well as food service, who lost their income or work due to COVID-19. Therefore, more consumers are willing to support the community. And then for the channel trends, consumers do go out less to follow the government advice. However, consumers still visit the supermarket once in a while for grocery shopping. So we observe that consumers still have the preference to handpick the fresh produce to look and pick by themselves. Several premium supermarkets in major cities such as Jakarta and Surabaya starting to tap into online grocery channels. They also start offering personal shopper, so shopping assistant services through WhatsApp, so that the consumer can order directly and have them to pick up the product and then arrange the delivery direct to home. While this type of penetration of online grocery is still relatively low and mostly only available in big cities, we also expect it to grow in the following years. And then also about e-commerce, this one is really interesting. E-commerce marketplace is the preferred way to go to shop, especially to middle to upper income earners. However, most of the consumers are still looking mostly to purchase non-food items. The consumers are becoming increasingly familiar with browsing, whether on mobile phone or on their other device. They do browsing at marketplace such as Tokopedia, Shopee, Lazada, and Bukalapak when they are unable to go out and buy the product by themselves. Consequently, we observe increasing brand activities on e-commerce, so they're offering discounts and promotion for consumers, as now consumers, they are looking both value and convenience. And then I would like to also highlight about the significant changes in food service as dining option is limited. Now the consumers relies on ride-hailing app instant delivery services such as the GoFood from Gojek as well as GrabFood from Grab. So these services will bring restaurant food to home. These platforms also offer discounts and cashback to attract consumers. And then also consequently, more restaurants is starting to offer frozen prepackaged food and easy to cook meal other than the usual takeaway menu, so that consumer can buy through the ride-hailing app, and then they can only do a very simple step at home or keep them frozen for the consumption on the next day or on the next evening or something.
Right. So from a grocery perspective, the non-food items are mostly we're seeing a lot of growth in the e-commerce channel, and the food items, particularly fruit and veg. The high-end consumers are still going to Ranch Market, Chemchicks, Lucky, Hero to go pick up their product.
You are right.
So could we then assume that those supermarkets are doing really good business now?
Maybe. I think so, because I consider that people are still have confidence in this supermarket's selection, as well as the quality and the safety of the product, because safety is now important. So I understand that the supermarkets still have a good trust and confidence from their consumer. However, as people are going out less, their frequency of going out shopping is now less. So I think that they are buying in a larger quantity, but maybe their frequency of going out to supermarket is like twice a month or once a month.
Right. So then, with the switch in the supermarkets going to more prepackaged foods, frozen food, dine at home, do it yourself, dine at home type meals, but also and there's that move to sort of vitamins, better for you food, functional food, immune boosting. But then from an import side, usually it takes 6 to 12 months for a product to be to go through the registration process before it can be on the shelf. Initially, are most of these trends moving toward it's working well for the Indonesian-based products, and then the imported products need to catch up afterwards, or how do you see that happening?
We see that I think it's still in a balance, because I noticed that consumer is still would like to try new products essentially, and they still have a good confidence in import products such as the Australian products. With consideration to the current economic situation and sometimes uncertainty, we notice that most business, so that the importer and distributor, they are becoming more careful in assessing new products, and then in making decision whether they are taking new products into the market, because then they will have to go through the whole registration process and listing process at supermarket as well. From our observation, we see that distributor would consider innovative products such as the one you mentioned, the better for you product, because in the future the consumer will still look to maintain their health and their immune. So this one is perceived to be giving like more health benefit, something better for the body essentially. And then for the packaged food, we understand that there is a preference for shelf-stable and ambient product, as it doesn't need temperature control, and then also it has a longer shelf life.
All right, great responses there from Agrika. I think I barraged questions there, and she answered them perfectly, as I expect she would. Great professional. So let's look at the categories. Now, considering how we normally do this, obviously, there are so many different categories, attendees participating in this webinar that are from so many different categories. So we have a look at those that seem to be represented the most, and then we look at three categories in focus. But over the course of this workshop series, we've covered so many different categories, depending on who's been attending. So we've looked at the consumer and demographic key indicators. We've looked at consumer and channel trends. So now we turn to category trends and category market sizes, and then that will lead into competitor data. So the first one we're going to have a look at is drinking milk. On the right-hand side are the brands that dominate in Indonesia, and you can see just about all of them are locally produced products. Drinking milk has maintained double-digit growth. It is perceived to have healthy attributes, better for you type attributes. We've also seen a shift to non-dairy milk drinks, such as soy and oat and rice milk. So that trend is starting to develop in Indonesia as well. There is also a trend towards single serve drink, so not necessarily a liter or 2 liters, but 250 ml for single consumption. Oops. There we go. Sorry, there was a slight delay on my keyboard. So when we look at the milk and cream trade data, so it's important to have a look at your competitors, not just based on the individual brands that you compete with, but also which countries you're competing against you within the same category. And so what we look at is the harmonized code system numbers. It can go up to 8 digits. For the purposes of this comparison, we've got to go into 4 digits, which includes milk and cream. And so when we look at, and this HS code system, it's international, and it's used by all the relevant trade agencies within each country to determine the movement of product, to document and record the movement of product, along with to be able to apply tariffs. Now, because each government is responsible for its own recording, the figures don't always match up. Sometimes they're close, sometimes they're wildly far apart. And that could be because of a difference in the timing in which the countries document the export data and import data. Could be the way they classify it. So even though there are classification codes, they may interpret it slightly different, or it may just even be an error, right? So in this particular instance here, we see there's a little bit of a difference, not too much, between the Indonesian import stats and the Australian export stats. So for milk and cream, using HS code 0401, we know that Indonesia predominantly imports product from New Zealand, followed by France, Thailand, and Australia is 4th. So fairly high up in the list, although New Zealand is by far the largest source from for the Indonesian market. For where do we mostly export milk and creams using HS code 0401 from Australia? Well, most of it goes to China by a significant amount, followed by Singapore, followed by Malaysia. In fact, a whole host of ASEAN markets, not including Indonesia. So Indonesia in this list would be passed beyond the top 10. When we look at functional beverages, on the right-hand side, these are the sort of the dominant brands in the Indonesian market. The functional beverages were, somewhat stagnant, mostly because of, and the brands on the right-hand side, as I may have mentioned, are mostly Indonesian produced, so local production. Because most of the people that consume it tend to be more active, because of the pandemic, they haven't been as active. And so sales have been stagnant. Being local production, these products are generally speaking more affordable and are being sold through retailers and e-commerce channels. We know that functional malt-based beverages are popular in Indonesia as a breakfast alternative, right? So it's sort of similar to our sanitarian Up and Go. Kombucha is starting to find its place in the Indonesian market. It's being seen mostly on e-commerce platforms. The expectation is that it'll start appearing in physical supermarkets in a not too distant future. It is mostly, or it is all, locally produced kombucha, but the expectation is that imported brands will start finding their way into the Indonesian market. When we look at the HS code 2202.90, so it's a pretty broad one. So it's not specifically kombucha. There's no specific code for kombucha or for functional beverages for that matter. So it's the closest one. We know that, so again, we see quite a big difference between the Indonesian import data versus the Australian export data. But what we're looking for here are themes. So we see from an Indonesian import perspective, it predominantly imports product from Malaysia and Thailand, reflecting value. South Korea, US, Australia comes in 5th. So top 5 again, from an import perspective. From an export perspective, products within this HS code predominantly go to New Zealand, followed by UK, and that would be, a lot of that would be Remedy. Remedy is doing particularly well in the UK market. Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Singapore, Canada, and then coming in 9th position is Indonesia. So relatively important market for anyone looking to export functional beverages. From a breakfast cereal perspective, brands are on the right. no surprise there. You know, a lot of it is the big American brands. Breakfast cereal category experienced growth thanks to the pandemic. A lot more people having breakfast at home as opposed to breakfast on their way to work in the car because of the long commute. And so, you know, when you're looking at cereals, and in particular when you're looking at sort of oats and granolas, they tend to be seen as a healthier alternative and healthier breakfast format. And so that is meeting the consumer demand of healthier lifestyles. When we have a look at the HS codes and the trade data, so 1904 is the code that you would generally use at a higher level for breakfast cereals. We see that Indonesia predominantly imports product from Malaysia, Thailand, China, again, reflecting value, followed by US. Australia comes in 8th. And when we look at it from an Australian export perspective, we predominantly export our cereals to New Zealand, followed by China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Malaysia. In fact, Indonesia doesn't make the top 10, although it's not that far off. So I can't remember, but it was like 11th, 12th, or 13th, something like that. So, you know, an important market for Australian breakfast cereals. You may say, great, look, Najib, this is amazing, you know, getting the economic and demographic indicators, trends, you know, trade data, all this kind of stuff. But, you know, where would we get this information from? Like, it must be really hard to find. It's not all that hard to find. It's just that it takes a lot of time to find it if you're not paying for somebody to do it for you. So some of this information you'd be able to get from Trade Organic, right? So Australian Organic Limited, I think we're delivering 7 or 8 of these workshops. And for every market, we've provided this data. So if you've been attending every one, you would see, and you'd be able to score a lot of the common data. Now, the category information changes from workshop to workshop, depending on who attends. But you start getting an idea of all the key important information, and it's there and it's available. Now, you can also get it from Austrade. Asialink has, you know, in particular, those country reports on a cultural perspective, very important. And in that, it has key economic and demographic information. Euromonitor, if you can afford their subscriptions, you know, and some of the industry associations like MLA, AusVeg, you know, they've got really good data as well. And, you know, I've got in there the Export Connect portal. We'll be launching that at the end of this month. That has all this kind of information available on a membership and subscription basis, and we've kept the membership and subscription fees really low. So, you know, keep an eye out for when we launch it, because if you want that kind of data, you for a very small amount of money, you are going to have it all summarized and put in your lap. So, next factor we need to assess in determining whether the Indonesian market is the right market for us or not, indeed, if any market is the right market for us or not, is looking at who your competitors are in market. Now, many suppliers we see focus purely on price, maybe weight, maybe the dominant claim, and that's it when they're assessing who their competitor is. But in fact, the focus really needs to be quite comprehensive. Like you need to be comprehensive in your focus on who your competitors are. So apart from knowing what the brand name is, having an image of the product to see what it looks like, and then once you see all the products compared with each other, you might start seeing a trend or a theme in what is being represented in that market, colors, sizes, things like that. Product weight is super important. Price, of course, is important. You've got the conversion, but you also need to see where is the product coming from. Right? You need to compare like with like. You need to see what are all the product claims. So not just if it's certified organic, but also if it's halal, and if it's gluten-free, and if it's fortified with calcium, protein enriched, you know, high in antioxidants, whatever it is. You've got to see what all the claims are so that you're able to determine your unique proposition and value versus the competitors in market. What type of packaging are they using? Is it glass, plastic, paper? what's its position in store? Is it only on its shelf in the one category, or is it on a gondola end? Is it at a cash counter? If your product is a condiment, is it available in the condiment section and the deli section with meats? What kind of promotions are being run? First of all, to determine, so when you do your price comparison, you're doing it against the actual price and not the promoted price, but also to get an idea of what type of promotions they run in market and what kind of spend you may need to have from a marketing perspective. In Indonesia, all packaging must identify who the importer and distributor is. So this is really important for you, because it'll either help you understand which importers to target. So you may see a complementary product being positioned really well in the store and think, okay, I want to know who that distributor is. Or you may see a direct competitor with very little difference to your product, and you'll see who their distributor is, and you may choose to avoid them because there's a chance that they'll take your product on and park it to protect the brand that they're already representing in market. You need a category photo, so not just a photo and an image of the individual product, but of the whole category, so you can see how you would fit in the category. And in fact, you may even want to use that when pitching to a buyer and say, look, this is what it looks like in Chemchicks, in Food Hall, in Ranch Market, and we belong in this spot right here, because this category is growing, and we're going to help this category grow by being different. And this is by belonging in, by being placed in here in this spot, will be growing the overall value within that category. You need to also, if you've got food service product, have a look at the menus of the high-end restaurants. A lot of those menus are available online now. Otherwise, you could visit the restaurants and have a look at their menus. And then, I'm always amazed. Many of our clients who are in seafood or meat, even though it may not be published on the menu where the meat is from, they tend to guess where it's coming from. And they, even in some instances, are able to guess from whom it's come from. Now, certainly if there's Australian beef or, oysters from South Australia or something like that, they'll say where it's come from, because it's a very important factor. It brings the premium nature to the product, and so that they can charge a little bit more for the product on the menu. So that also sometimes help, whether it's a steak from the US or from wherever it may be. When we can travel, asking wait staff can sometimes yield a result. In terms of, not all wait staff in Indonesia will be able to speak English, but certainly there are many that can, and they can provide some good value around what items within the menu are the most popular, and any question you have. And then once you've got your data from reviewing e-commerce marketplaces, from visiting supermarkets, from menus from food service, from getting what you can from the market, you then compare across all channels, and then that will help you form an idea and a picture as to where your product would sell best, what type of price you need to pitch it at, and what your unique selling proposition will be. So when we have a look at the milks, whether it be dairy milk or plant-based milk, these are just some of the products that are available in Indonesia. So, we've just gone 6. When we do our competitor reviews, we have usually work off a minimum of 100 brands, provided that the product is not super niche, because you really want to see a lot to get a really good feel for where you're at. So here we see some product from Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and of course, locally produced product. And we see the price ranges for the imported product being predominantly around the same, between the $4.50 to $5 mark. And then we see the local product, no surprise, being considerably cheaper. From a kombucha and functional beverage perspective, all Indonesian-based products. And I think Jamu, I think it's called Jamu, is the sort of the local health drink. It's not kombucha, but they're certainly familiar with the idea of tonics and drinking healthy beverages. And when we look at breakfast cereals, we see many Australian brands there. So, Orgran, of course, we see, from a free from perspective, Carmen's is there. We see Red Tractor, the oats in the market. We see local product, of course, and then in fact there's a brand, an Indonesian brand of the clusters, which the packaging looks sensational actually. And then we've got product from US and Switzerland as well. And in the breakfast cereal space, we see it varies quite wildly in price as well as pack size, as compared to the other two categories that we just viewed. So once you've got all this data, you put it into a spreadsheet where you have where you saw the product from. So either if you went into market and visited the supermarket outlet, or from their e-commerce store, what's the brand, what's the weight, what's the price in the Indonesian currency converted into Australian. Then you look at per gram pricing, so you can compare gram for gram. Then you can, if you know what the margins are, you start stripping back the retailer and distributor margin, and then that'll help you understand what it's landing for. Then you put in what you think your landed price should be, and then you can start looking at the price differential. You can know whether you're ahead or behind. That in itself is not enough. You then need to see where is the product coming from. So invariably, if it's product manufactured in Asia, and in this particular case, Indonesia, it's going to be cheaper. That doesn't mean you're not presenting value, as long as you've got claims that you can attribute. And the fact that it's coming from Australia gives you that a sense of premium. Know that Indonesian buyers looking for value. So just because it's from Australia, it doesn't mean they're prepared to spend anything. It's got to present value for money. You need to list what type of packaging it is, the position in store it was, and whether there were any promotions being held. So so once you've got this data, you're then able, and this is a similar type format for when you do it online. Have hyperlink it to hyperlink the brand to the e-commerce store that you saw it on, document the price, type of packaging, the product claims, where it's from, so you can start building this idea and theme and understanding of what your unique selling proposition is for that market. And then you build your scorecard. So let's say you're assessing all ASEAN markets. So then you look at the GDP growth rates, GDP per capita, consumer trends, so you'd give it a score yourself. Other trends in the market around convenience and healthy eating, whatever. Is your product well suited for convenience and healthy eating? Well, then you give yourself 5 out of 5, The ease of doing business, you look at the channel trends. Again, are you mostly retail, food service and e-commerce, and is what's happening in that market suitable for your product? And are you seeing the right type of growth rates within these channels? Then you'd look at the retail sales value for your category, the growth rate for your category year on year for the next 5 years. Are the trends favorable to the type of product that you're looking to take into the market? You then look at the import data. So this is the trade data. So at a country level, is the market you're looking to go to importing product from Australia? So that would make it a lot more positive. And or are they importing a lot of product from North America and Europe and New Zealand? So you can see that importing high-end is something that they do in that market. And then you look at the competitor review, and then you see who your competitors are. And are there products that are similar to yours, so that you can see consumers are looking for that type of product? Are there competitors that are directly competing with you? And so how are they based in terms of price? Is there a niche? Is there a product that's not available in the market that you can fill that gap within that category? Now, the Indonesia market, it's one of those double-edged sword situations where it's got such a lengthy registration process that it discourages many people from entering the market, and maybe even yourself. But those that are willing to go through that pain means that on shelf, you don't have as many competitors as you would, say, in Singapore or Hong Kong or the UAE, where the entry requirements are much easier. And so every man and his dog is exporting product to those markets, trying to get a foothold. So this is something you need to consider when you're looking at the Indonesian market. And so then once you've given everything a score, you tally them up, and then you compare, and then the table will sort of give you an idea at a desktop level as well as if you've gone into the market and looked at the products in store, which are the markets of most opportunity. Let's hear from Agrika in terms of which are the categories of interest that she's seeing get most attention in the Indonesian market.
One that recently we observe is still mainly in packaged food, and then also the one with like a additional health benefit, and the one that's innovative, basically something that is new. If it's a snack, what is new from this snack? Whether this one is coming from like a natural ingredient or will give immunity booster, things like that.
What about organic? Because most of the people sitting in listening to this webinar at the moment are predominantly certified organic producers and processors. Do you see, has organic, is it in more demand now in the Indonesian market?
Our consumer here is currently more familiar with the organic term for fresh produce, so for vegetables and for fruits as well as the other fresh produce. I understand that in the future they will be start looking into a more organic products. However, also it is still essential to educate the consumer about the Australian organic standards, because it might be that the understanding and the knowledge of the consumer here is still quite limited to the the organic fresh produce. So to give them more knowledge about the Australian organic products as well as its benefits, it's going to be able to build the confidence and their knowledge, and hopefully they will prefer more organic product in the future.
And so then, to round it all off, I guess, what kind of advice would we give to anyone looking to get into the food and agribusiness sector? Food and agribusiness exports into the Indonesian market. It's definitely one of patience. We heard that from John. It's one of diligent research, understanding what the opportunity is. So this morning, in fact, I had a call with one of our clients who has had a very strong inquiry from the Indonesian market, and she was asking me about the registration process. Now, she has a product that she changes the recipe every 6 to 12 months. So I made her aware of the fact that with the registration process, it could take longer than 12 months. And if the recipe changes in the registration process, it's not a simple matter of just giving them the change in the recipe and then they approve it. You almost have to start all over again. So she will perpetually be reapplying for registration until she stops changing her recipes. And so for her, Indonesia would not necessarily be a low-hanging fruit, but otherwise would have been a great market for her. Let's see what Agrika has to say. Also noting that, in the advice that Agrika would share, and certainly the advice that we would share, is support is available. And so we'll also hear from the Trade Commissioner, Australia Trade Commissioner, Hannah.
Firstly, when the exporter is looking into Indonesian market, my first suggestion is to also consider the taste profile and preferences of Indonesian consumer. As our taste profile may be quite different from the Australian. I understand that the consumer is actually starting to be more familiar with Western style food, Western style breakfast, as example. They also like to try new products. We notice with the increasing interest in granola and muesli products from Australia. However, we've also heard feedback such as the taste is not sweet enough, or this one tastes like healthy food, which is, not good, not considered as good food. However, we understand that they will also learn to accept it and to like it. Therefore, considering a testing session with your Indonesian partner is important, considering, let's say, a smaller packaging for Indonesian market compared to, the usual packaging that you have in Australia is also something that the distributor in Indonesia will value. And then secondly is doing business in Indonesia also means nurturing a good relationship with your distributor and importer partner, because they'll be the one registering your product as well as looking after your product in Indonesia. Together with them, you will be building the brand, educating the consumer, as well as looking after the relationship with Indonesian supermarkets and food service if you're supplying to them. Exporters to also consider allocating budget and resources, not only when penetrating the market, such as in doing product launch or promotion, but also in the longer run, because you're going to grow the product and brand together with them. Lastly, we would like to also suggest for the exporter to familiarize themselves with what's going on in the market, as well as the regulatory environment. I do think that the session and workshop like this is very useful to keep exporters updated and more familiar with what's currently going on in the market.
Brilliant. That's really good advice. And I think very important also is for Australian food and agribusinesses to avail themselves of all the support that is available. And so, many state government agencies, trade investment agencies have offices in Indonesia that can help. But of course, Austrade, being the National Economic Development Agency, is really there. And as I mentioned earlier, I've had nothing but excellent experiences with the Indonesian office and Agrica in particular. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Hannah Wade, who is the Trade and Investment Commissioner in Jakarta. Hello, Hannah.
Hi, Najib. Lovely to be here.
Please share with everyone now has had been overloaded with market insights, both on a data basis as well as some wonderful first-hand advice from Agrica, from your team. As Austrade, what kind of help can you provide to the food and agribusinesses on this webinar?
Thanks, Najib. And yes, I think I'm so impressed by Agrica's excellent insights, of course, and it's a pleasure to work with business development managers like Agrica throughout the world. As you sort of alluded to, we have more than 70 offices worldwide, and our role at Austrade is really to support Australian businesses to find export markets and success, and as well as attract productive foreign investment into Australia. But for agribusiness and food exporters specifically, the Australian government as a whole is really aware that COVID-19 has changed the landscape for many exporters, with disrupted supply chains and fundamental changes in consumer demand that Agrica has really taken us through in good detail. So in response, we have a new program called the Agribusiness Expansion Initiative, and this is actually a $72.7 million initiative to allow a significant surge in Austrade's and other agency support to Australian exporters, like many on the call today. And our role will really be around supporting diversification and targeting of international markets, and this includes for us new specialist staff coming on board in Australia and internationally, including in our ASEAN markets and in Indonesia, and also some additional activities to strengthen our showcasing of quality Australian agribusiness and food products. So I definitely encourage everyone to have a look at the Austrade website and subscribe to our newsletters. We've got lots of upcoming initiatives that we're running and doing a lot of planning at the moment. I might also just mention that there's a number of other programs as well. So we do have the International Freight Assistance Mechanism for exporters affected by air freight linkage issues during the pandemic. And there's also been some changes to the Export Market Development Grants program, which we're really hopeful will enhance Australian exporters during this time and longer term too in their marketing efforts in international markets. So I would say, for those on the call who are interested, have a look at our website and learn about our services. Some might even have a dedicated client manager or trade start manager connected to Austrade already. And so we always encourage those who do have one to reach out regularly to give updates on progress. And we've also got a new website, export.gov.au, which has export guides and data covering a vast number of food and beverage product categories. So it's really interesting, and I think it'd be great for people to have a look at that too.
All right, great. So other support available. There's, of course, Australian Organic. This Trade Organic program is there to help certified organic businesses get into export markets. Each state government agency has their own sort of trade investment department, and pathway programs, grants, and the like. Export Finance Australia can help underwrite some cash flow for you based on export deals that you've signed up that your bank is not willing to give you an overdraft facility or loans for. FIAL has Meet the Buyer events, and of course the Australian Food Catalogue. And then you have industry associations like Food SA, Food and Agribusiness Network. They're all doing things, providing opportunities for businesses to enter export markets. You know, there's a lot of support available. You don't need to be doing it on your own. So before I hand over to Josephine to cover the organic certification requirements to get the product into the Indonesian market, we just got two very quick questions for you to respond to. First of all, what was your overall experience with this session in particular, the Export Connect session on the market insights for the Indonesian market, 1 being poor and 5 being excellent? And would you recommend this session to peers that are interested in developing export markets? This is really important feedback for us in terms of understanding whether we're on the mark. In particular, we've just started pulling together our webinars where we integrate pre-recorded Q&As, like what we did with Agrica. So we're keen to see whether you've had a good experience with that. You know, and certainly if any of you want to give any feedback afterwards, reach out and let us know. But yeah, so if you could score your overall experience, 1 being poor and 5 being excellent, and if you would, whether you would recommend this session to industry peers or not. So just, I've got 5 more seconds. Let's get the last one in. All right, brilliant. So I will now stop sharing my screen and ask Josephine to come on.
Thank you, Najib. So the technical side, just about to start. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Yes, perfect. Okay, so my name is Josephine. I'm Technical Officer here at Australian Organic Ltd. I'll be taking you through the import and export requirements of Indonesia per se. So typically, there are 2 stages to this process. 1 is getting your organic product out of Australia, and the second is getting the product into Indonesia. And typically, getting it out of the country has been more difficult with the last few countries that we've been covering. But when it comes to Indonesia, they have a lot of different rules and regulations that you need to familiarize yourself with, or alternatively make sure that you partner up with an Indonesian counterpart that can take care of these for you. So with organic produce, for those that are new to this webinar series, the export market of Australian organic and biodynamic goods is regulated. They are considered prescribed goods underneath the Act. And because of this, it's illegal to export such goods without the appropriate approval. And the way that you get this approval is through an export control organic goods rule per se, specifically the organic goods certificate. And this is required for each consignment. And this organic goods certificate, previously known as an organic product certificate, is really to show the countries that we are exporting our organic products to that this product has been grown to organic and biodynamic standards, which the importing countries like Indonesia do require. So this specifically references the national standard for organic and biodynamic produce, and hopefully you are well familiar with this standard. It outlines all the rules and regulations for this production. So being certified to the Australian Certified Organic Standard, or the ACOS, isn't sufficient for exporting organic product. You need to be certified to the national standard, and if that is something that you need to change, you need to talk to your certifying body about that. So an organic goods certificate, as mentioned previously, is required for all organic exports, and this is from 10 litres to 10 kilograms in weight. If it's organic, it needs an organic goods certificate. So the only thing that it excludes is cosmetics and pet cosmetics, as technically they don't need to be certified to leave the country. So talk further with your certifying body and just make sure that this isn't required. So Indonesian import requirements. So as Najib mentioned, there is a free trade agreement. So there's no tariffs for products that are going into Indonesia. However, there are increased taxes on certain products. The Indonesian standard is iPhone based. And if you want to familiarize yourself with the organic rules per se, those are sort of the three main documents that are specifically to the organic labeling, the organic processing, and the organic standard in Indonesia that are sometimes difficult to find in English versions, but nothing that Google Translate can't help you with. So the Indonesian import requirements. As mentioned previously, in terms of getting your organic products into Indonesia, the market is fully regulated, which means that you need to prove that the organic products that you're selling in Indonesia are organic. And this means that you need to have the organic goods certificate as proof, and you also need to re-register your organic product with one of the 10 certifying bodies that are listed on the CAN website. So you also need to have Organic Indonesia on the packaging labels. There are sticker options, but there are sort of two ways that you can do this. You can either certify your manufacturing company directly with one of these 10 certification bodies. However, you still need an Indonesian counterpart for this process. Alternatively, you can import your product in bulk into Indonesia and get it repackaged by an Indonesian counterpart. At the end of the day, you need that Indonesian counterpart to be able to get the product into the country. And also for a number of other reasons, because with the organic side of things, that's only one part of importing goods into Indonesia. Dependent on what you are importing, you need a different certificate for each product. So this becomes even more problematic when you have a processed product that contains, plant and meat or other things like that. So with the commodity-specific certificates, each certificate comes from a different Indonesian department. And so not only do you need an Indonesian counterpart for legal reasons per se, getting your head around getting these certificates for these different products yourself can be very problematic as well. But as mentioned previously, as long as you have your organic goods certificate for your organic sort of equivalent with the Indonesian certifying body, the organic goods are covered. It's the other regulations on the importing practices for organic products, or not necessarily organic products, but for livestock products. Meat has to be halal. Processed foods, you need the health certificate, and plant products, it's the phytosanitary, and I'll talk more about that. So for meat, as Najib and John have mentioned, it needs to be halal. And I think that my call, if you haven't been on this website before, it's Manual of Importing Country Requirements, is an excellent way to find a full list of the Islamic organisations in Australia that you need to coordinate with to get your meat registered halal for sale in Indonesia. On top of this, You need to be also wary of gelatin in any processed products. It is typically of pork origin, so you can get vegan alternatives of gelatin, but if there is any pork-derived gelatin, you need to have the proper labelling on your product to say that the product does contain a pork derivative. And the same as with alcohol. It's a 21-year drinking age in Indonesia, and they need specific labelling for that. And so really depending on your product, I recommend that you have a look at MyCall, that you really talk to your Indonesian counterparts and make sure that you understand what you need to do with your product to make it acceptable to go into Indonesia. On top of that, for live export, the country has a very strict rule that 20% of the live export cattle need to be imported just to be breeders to the national stock per se. So these are all things that you need to consider before you even start the registration process. The product-specific import requirements also continue for fruit. You know, there's special treatments that you need to do for fruit fly cold treatment. All plant consignments are subject to quarantine, similar to in Australia. And so, especially for organic, you need to make sure that you are doing your utmost to make sure that none of this will be an issue when you are shipping your product to Indonesia. So there's also bans on products that the government can perceive to be grown locally, like rice or certain tropical fruits. And I know that these sometimes aren't really what we would be exporting from Australia, but you also need to make sure that your product isn't per se on that list. There's also additional Indonesian labelling requirements. There's also options for stickers with this. But like I said, all of these regulations are things that pertain to all products, not just necessarily organic products per se. So this is why you have to go to the MyCall, you know, consult other companies, people who are also doing it, and find out all these things about your product specific requirements. So in summary, before you send anything anywhere, contact your certification body and get that organic goods certificate. It's per consignment that you need this. Contact your certification body as well if they have any previous experience with sending things to Indonesia. But as I said, typically from the Australian end, as long as you have the organic goods certificate, you're good to go. It's the Indonesian counterparts that then will need to help you with all the Indonesian regulations on that side. So as said, on the CAN website, you can find the 10 different certification bodies. Also, if you use an importing company in Indonesia, they can do all this work for you per se, as long as you provide that organic goods certificate. I definitely would recommend MyCall and the Australian Trade Commission, as Najib has also recommended. There's a lot of country-specific and product-specific regulations, which in the case of Indonesia is required, given that the organic side of things isn't the most important here, not important per se, but given that the regulations for the products in general are very strict to go into the country. And now, if there are any questions, please send them through, and Najib and I will endeavour to answer them.
Any questions in relation to the market development side or the certified organic side? Certainly, if you've got questions you want to ask afterwards, you're more than welcome to reach out to Josephine or myself.
Well, if there aren't any questions, I would like to thank you, Catherine, John and Najib, for your time and expertise today. I also want to invite all the viewers to the next Trade Organic webinar, which is on the 14th of September, and it is about South Korea. So that is definitely an interesting market. for the organic sector. And in addition to that, on the 24th of August, we also have organic certification for exporters, if anybody listening in would be interested on that. And you can find more details on the Australian Organic website. But yeah, please send through any questions, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Josephine, and thank you to Grika and Hannah as well for contributing today.
Thank you.
All right, cheers.